Well, hello, everyone. We'll give people 1 more minute to file in, and then we'll start off with our webinar. Thanks. All right, then, why don't we get started? Hello, everyone, again. I'm Sofika Kostniuk, Managing Director at Aquatic Life Institute. I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, otherwise known as Common Day Vancouver, Canada. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you and my team to begin sharing some insights with how people in the seafood business, yourselves, can begin to engage in this really pressing issue of aquatic animal welfare. This issue has been a highly neglected topic for quite some time, but it's certainly an issue that can no longer be ignored. We're incredibly encouraged by the positive feedback that we've received for this webinar. We have over 100 registrants, and to us, this is simply an indication of how primed the discussion is for exploration for all of us. So today we'll quickly run through the basics of aquatic animal welfare, why and how your own companies can begin making advances on this issue. And then we'll follow the presentation with a Q&A session. We will then afterwards share a copy of this recorded session along with a number of other resources and contact information for our organization and point people so that you can begin to engage with us whenever you're ready. Just a few housekeeping items. Everyone is muted with videos off upon entry, but you can absolutely, and please do, type your questions into the chat at any point in time. We'll either have staff members respond to you throughout the webinar, or we'll actually read out those questions and address them during the Q&A at the end. Again, the session is being recorded and will be distributed following in the next few days. So who are we? Well, Aquatic Life Institute is a US-based nonprofit. We're a registered charity. We were established in 2019 with the sole purpose of improving the lives of all aquatic animals caught in the global food system, so whether they're farmed or wild, in aquaculture operations or in wild capture fisheries. We focus our work through 3 primary pillars. We work very closely with certifiers in our certifier campaign. We engage global and country-level governments to strengthen and introduce policy on aquatic animal welfare. And then we work through a really, really broad global coalition that we coordinate. We have approximately 130 organizations presently signed on, representing 66 countries and 6 continents. So we really need everyone to succeed and everyone to be engaged in this conversation so that animal welfare begins to advance. So why should you care about aquatic animal welfare? Well, we really believe that all animals matter, and we certainly can no longer afford to exist in a vacuum. We've become familiar with considerations for other animals and their welfare, for example, hens with the global cage-free campaigns, pigs, gestation crates, cow milk, antibiotics, hormones, etc. Fish and other aquatic animals are, of course, a highly evolved, highly diverse group of animals. They're absolutely critical to supporting biodiversity, to supporting habitats. They're a key food source for billions of people around the world. 65 million people directly rely on fisheries and aquaculture for jobs worldwide. And if you believe in the prevailing scientific theory, we of course evolved from fish. So these are our ancestors. But more seriously, we do need to expand our consciousness and our considerations to promote the welfare of these really, really important species. And we're talking about a whole lot of these individuals. And I want to underscore that we need to start thinking about them as individuals rather than tons. And we're aiming to improve the lives of around 35 times more individuals than all land-based animals combined. So we're talking around 100 billion individual fish that are farmed every single year, 350 to 400 billion shrimp that are farmed every year. And then in the wild, the best estimates are 2 to 3 trillion individual animals. So it's really an extraordinary number. Now, how do we begin to tackle such a broad group of individuals with such individual needs and complex collective needs? It's really important to understand how fish suffer in wild environments and how they suffer in farmed environments. Before we go there, though, it's also important to note that this issue squarely lines up with the global goals, UN's Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 14, which you're likely familiar with, life underwater. But if we begin to think about this issue holistically, and if we begin to tackle it appropriately, there will also be significant improvements with SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 5, gender equity, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, and SDG 13, climate action. This is really a timely and highly relevant issue that requires urgent attention. For people in the seafood industry, of course, quality is always a huge consideration. And in 2019, there was a study that was published in a peer-reviewed academic journal that also pointed to the fact that animals, aquatic animals that are raised in a more humane fashion, also have higher fillet quality. To me, this just simply makes perfect sense. The lower stressed an animal is, the higher its own health and the quality of the fillet. So let's begin demystifying this term, aquatic animal welfare. We've really defined it as based on the 5 freedoms approach that's taken from best practices for land-based animals, and you're likely quite familiar with some of these concepts. So 1, the freedom to access sustenance. 2, the freedom to enjoy an appropriate environment. 3, the freedom to live in an environment that is free of disease, but when disease presents itself, that it's appropriately treated. 4, the freedom to enjoy sufficient space. And 5, the freedom to promote good psychological health and avoid unnecessary mental suffering. And just like humans, many aquatic animals have been shown to be capable of both positive and negative physical and psychological experience. So it really is our responsibility to create opportunities for these animals that allow them to enjoy a life actually that's worth living, rather than one that simply allows them to be kept alive, or that we simply focus on minimizing the worst forms of suffering. Again, to me, this makes perfect sense. So let's start diving into the basics of aquaculture and animal welfare in this regard. In 2020, Aquatic Life Institute led an effort with the support of a number of other leading NGOs to produce a very simple sort of 5-point criteria about aquatic animal welfare in aquaculture settings. And we broke it down into 5 key categories: environmental enrichment, feed composition and feeding, space requirements, stocking density, water quality, stunning and slaughter. This is again following those 5 freedoms as we touched upon, that sort of formulated the basis of how we think about aquatic animal welfare. We had over 85 organizations around the world sign on to these 5 key criteria, which means that there is global alignment, a wonderful starting point for all the other conversations that are underway. And you, of course, I'm sure are familiar with the fact that aquaculture is an incredibly diverse pursuit. And animals can suffer in various stages of their experience as they are reared in aquaculture settings. And this can be anything starting from hatcheries, experiencing crowding, experiencing low oxygen settings, experiencing inappropriate lighting, low stimulus, and so on. In this basic depiction from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, we see really how diverse the industry is. So we can have open net pens, geodesic underwater structures. We can simply drop lines down into the water and have our shellfish grow on those lines, land-based closed containment systems, recirculating aquaculture systems, ponds, etc., and many more. And in real life, this is what a lot of the facilities look like. They're intensive production facilities. There's high density. Often this leads to the need to utilize antibiotics and pesticides to control disease outbreaks. There's often low water quality, often a high use of fish meal fish oil from wild populations, thus putting additional pressure on those already stressed populations and utilizing protein that would otherwise be better utilized for human consumption. The poor practices that are employed in these highly intense production methods can also lead to unintended negative consequences. So we can have mangrove deforestation, which leads to destabilization of our climates and destabilization of our coastlines. We can have poor labor practices, high carbon footprints, biodiversity, and more. So animal welfare is somewhat understood, at least in these environments, because the animals need to be grown out and then sold into the market. But the lens through which animal welfare is viewed needs to evolve. A place where this conversation is actually extremely new is in wild capture fisheries. And there's a very different relationship, I would argue, between the producers in wild capture fisheries and the animals that they're catching versus those in an aquaculture setting. Really interestingly, though, and encouragingly, this conversation is also picking up traction quite rapidly. So where does a fish suffer in a wild capture setting? Well, of course, it's towards the very end of its life phase. Certainly during the capture, retrieval, onboard handling, live storage, if there is live storage, and stunning, we hope, but certainly during the slaughter process. From a market perspective, just like with land animals, as we mentioned before, sort of a happier, healthier fish can end up producing a higher quality fillet and higher quality product, which can ultimately lead to a higher price point. So similarly, how do we distill this complex concept of animal welfare in wild capture fisheries into something that's digestible? Well, last year, just a year ago in March, we published the first ever wild capture fisheries welfare recommendations. Again, 85 organizations signed on to to these recommendations, even though arguably wild fish lead lives of far higher welfare than those in an aquaculture setting. They experience far less suffering, but it's in that end phase of their life that the suffering is almost unimaginable when we really think about it. They're almost always fully conscious when they're either asphyxiated, crushed to death, dismembered, or eviscerated. So we absolutely must begin doing better than we have been doing to date. We also realize that we can't just put the concerns out there into the public sphere. We need to start coming up with practical solutions. So exploring some of the most common gear types in wild capture fisheries, we know that these are some that have the highest negative consequences, from bottom trawling to long lining, issues of bycatch, suffering and dismemberment come up. And in the real world, this is what these problematic technologies look like. The scale is absolutely astounding. The global appetite for fish continues to increase year over year. The Food and Agriculture Organization is estimating, and this is back in 2019, that 20.4 kilograms of fish per person per year were being consumed, and that number was steadily on the rise. So there really is a race to extract as much animal protein out of the ocean as possible. And it's just absolutely invariable that this leads to suboptimal practices being employed. So on the practical solutions front, in June of last year, we also published the first ever best practices report for wild capture fisheries that focused on those 5 key welfare criteria. And to our surprise, and of course, great delight, the UN Ocean Decades Program endorsed our publication. So we really feel like we're onto something useful. Now, to the most important question of the day, why is this issue important to you, and why should it matter right now? Well, I certainly hope that we've established the fact that animals do and should matter, and it's no longer appropriate to take a speciesism approach. So who is supporting this type of view? Well, a lot of governments are beginning to take action on this. In fall of 2021, the UN FAO, again, Food and Agriculture Organization, verbatim incorporated our animal welfare guidance into their Shanghai Declaration. That same year, the Canadian Salmonid Code of Practice also incorporated our guidance into their welfare language. Last year in the UK in April, the government rolled out the Animal Sentience Bill, where decapods and cephalopods, so lobsters, octopus, crab, were all recognized as sentient beings. And we're certainly seeing global seafood certifiers getting into this conversation as well. We really have an ethical duty to treat these animals with far higher regard than we have been to date. And to the issue of, do fish feel pain? Well, there have been a few decades worth of scientific publications certainly underscoring the fact that they do. We, of course, experience and understand pain quite differently than the way fish express pain, but the science is irrefutable at this point in time. So some trends and opportunities. This is a really timely issue. If I was a business leader at this point in time, I think I would be working really hard to figure out how to address this matter proactively and not be left managing the risks after the fact. So we have governments waking up to this issue. We have that 2030 line drawn in the sand where we significantly have to change our practices and start seeing improvements in the way that we're interrelating with ecosystems, with the world, with the climate. Consumers are getting on board, certifiers are getting board. So we really want to help you succeed. And I'm just going to share that my own journey into this space is quite recent. It only started about 2 years ago. Prior to that, I had been working in the ocean conservation and sustainable seafood space for almost 20 years on really important issues of sustainability, biodiversity, ensuring habitat loss was minimized, and so on. But I honestly have to say that I never considered the well-being of the individuals in the system. Clearly, that's no longer the case. And I'm really grateful for this transformative journey that I've been on. It's really, really changed my approach and my mindset in so many different settings. And hopefully I can spark a similar transformation or awakening for yourselves. So practically speaking, how does this happen? And how does this start being incorporated into things like supply chain policies, corporate social responsibility policies, environmental and social governance policies, or just overall sustainable policies within a company? Some questions that you might want to start asking yourselves, if you haven't been already, is, have you mapped out the risks associated with your business related to animal welfare? Are there strategies that you're planning on adopting for animal welfare in sourcing policies? Have you started thinking about diversifying the seafood offerings and looking at things like alternative proteins or lower trophic level species or vegetarian species? We really feel that this is a major risk for a company if they're not beginning to think about how to address these concerns. Carbon emissions are a significant concern over fishing, food security globally. We certainly have some initial ideas about how this could get incorporated into your business practices. So of course, looking at sourcing and procurement policy language and sort of expanding that definition and priorities to begin including aquatic animal welfare. Certainly one of the first steps would be to commit to all of your seafood being certified by a credible certification scheme or a rating scheme. With the certification scheme, it's traceable, it's verifiable, we know what's going on in that system. Another incredibly timely issue that's popping up around the globe right now is the latest pursuit to farm a new species, octopus. And this is very, very concerning. There's strong public dissent on this issue. We're seeing policymakers like in Washington state proactively attempting to put in place bans for any future development of such facilities. In Hawaii, there was a recent intervention where their facility was shut down. So putting in place a ban on buying farmed octopus products when they're available on the market would certainly resonate really well. And then you could commit to exploring pilot projects between yourselves, technology companies, producers, to show the proof of possibility. And we can certainly help you make supply chain connections. We can certainly work with your suppliers to help them as they begin to tackle this issue. Now, why we're sort of pushing on the fact that all seafood should be in a credible certification scheme? Well, all seafood traded globally is, or 40% of all seafood traded globally lies under a certification scheme or a rating scheme. So right there, that's a critical pinch point in the seafood supply chain. And arguably, one certifier could potentially positively influence at one moment hundreds, if not thousands of farms when they increase their standards and strengthen the language. And we've seen this happening. Over the last 2 and a bit years, Aquatic Life Institute has submitted over 40 different feedbacks to a variety of global seafood certifiers to help them strengthen their language or introduce new language on aquatic animal welfare. And we've really seen them stepping up to the plate. Within the next 6 months to 1 year, we're aware of at least 3 new updates to these global standards that will, again, advance the conversation on animal welfare. So last summer, in June, we published the first ever benchmark report for 6 of the largest seafood certifiers on the planet. You can see across the top are 5 key welfare criteria, and each of those criteria are broken down in a 2-point system for a total of 10 possible points. Following this release, we followed up with each one of the certifiers and provided specific improvement details and have been supporting them as they've been working towards strengthening their language. Totally acknowledge that no certification scheme is ever going to be perfect, no farm is ever going to be perfect, but we have to begin committing to a journey of continuous improvement to start making gains on this issue. So in terms of next steps, Aquatic Life Institute can certainly support you in crafting corporate policy language. We can help guide you with species-specific welfare on the most commonly farmed species. We can help you look into your supply chain in the wild capture fishery space. We can support by making connections to producers on the ground, to technology companies, or really anything else that you require to start creating the change that needs to happen. So we're here, please use us as a resource. And we want to make this as easy as possible because, again, we need all ships to rise. We need everyone to succeed in this space. So on that note, I think I'll wrap up. We have around 15 to 20 minutes for a question and answer period. Following that, we will be sending out our communication to everyone via email with many resources that I touched upon today. And yeah, please do follow us on our social media channels, sign up to our newsletters so that you can stay up to speed on the developments and any new announcements about aquatic animal welfare. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. The session has been recorded, but I will just have my team or a few members of the team pop up onto the screen and they can introduce themselves. Thank you.
I can start. Hello, everyone. I'm Catalina Lopez. I am the director of the Aquatic Animal Alliance, which is one of our main programs. It's a coalition of 130 organizations around the world working to improve aquatic animal welfare. And I also lead the aquaculture certification engagement for Aquatic Life Institute. So yeah, looking forward to hear your questions.
I can go next. Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Chris. I joined the Aquatic Life Institute in 2020, one of the original game members here. My role within ALI is leading our advocacy efforts and research efforts into welfare issues in capture fisheries and promoting improved welfare standards within international institutions such as the UN.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending our session today. I'm Cecilia. I'm the Aquatic Animal Alliance Engagement Coordinator. I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil, and I'll be happy to support you with any information you need to incorporate aquatic animal welfare policies in your business. So thank you again.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. And I should highlight that our team is fully remote, though we're headquartered in New York. And we are a multilingual, multinational team. Chris is in Madrid, Catalina is in Mexico City, and Cecilia, as mentioned, is in Sao Paulo, but we have a number of other locations for our staff. So we tend to travel a lot, and hopefully we'll be running into you at a number of events in the coming months and years. And I see that we have at least one question. Maybe someone from the team could handle the Q&A.
I can read the question if anyone wants to jump in on this. So Kathy says, love this. Thank you so much for caring. I am wondering if this would mean that seafood will then necessarily be significantly more expensive, something which I actually do support, in order to be high on welfare for fish. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe I'll ask Chris to hop in on that. And I know that she's been doing a little bit of research on this because, of course, price point is a major consideration with anything to do with food, and particularly nowadays with inflation.
Thanks. Kathy, great to see you on the webinar. Thank you for your question. I do get this a lot. I think you're asking about prices when it comes to what consumers have to pay. And I think we do need to see more research done in that area, and especially, you know, public surveys to see how much they are willing to pay. And I think that will give an answer to retailers in terms of what kinds of price point they want to set. But what I often get asked is from a different perspective, which is the cost of adopting welfare implementation on the producer themselves. So, for example, a company that owns fishing vessels, if they wanted to implement humane types of capture gear and retrieval methods or stunning and slaughter on board, how would that impact their operations in terms of costs? And there's been a few studies to show that the costs can be minimal, especially if it's done by a bigger company. Obviously, for smaller ones, they may need some incentives, you know, economic incentives or some support from the government or, you know, other types of investors. Ultimately, it's down to the companies themselves to take in, you know, the pros and cons and whether they want to make that initial investment into building humane technology on board. But I've also heard that for at least one company in the Pacific Northwest that implemented humane capture gear and humane stunning on board, they did it out of animal welfare concerns, but that they found that they were able to command a higher selling point in terms of pricing because of the higher quality product. So it depends on, you know, what fishery you're in or what aquaculture production you're in, how much tonnage you need to process in a day or in an hour, and how much that would cost. But in the end, you know, purchasing these machinery, for example, for stunning and slaughter, will be eventually an added asset for the company. So I'm sorry to give you kind of a long-winded answer that also didn't really respond to your question, because it still does lack some research in this area. But you know, I'll try to keep you posted on any new research, and this is the best to my knowledge, unless others have more to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, you know, including animal welfare considerations and strategies can reduce mortality rates and morbidity rates, so disease and death in farms, which ultimately means that they lose less products, so they can sell more fish and more products to the market. So it could balance out the higher cost of getting a certification, for example, if those strategies are put in the farm, just because they lose less product. So it's always kind of a positive aspect to include these strategies in the production setting, because ultimately it leads to better results in product, like Chris said, like the quality, but also the amount that they can sell. Should I continue with another question? Great. All right, so Julia asks, would you agree that it would be a good move for seafood businesses to increase transparency and communication to consumers about their animal welfare policies and practices? This could increase demand for higher welfare products and support companies in making improvements in this respect. Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I can jump in on this, and then maybe Catalina or Cecilia, you have some insights to share from your prior corporate engagement work on other species. But I would say 100%. I think increasing transparency, putting policy language out there that proactively addresses this issue is critical. Consumers are watching. Consumers are very smart, very educated nowadays. And I've just been thinking about this as kind of the perfect positive storm of activity that's happening around aquatic animal welfare. Again, 2030 is a looming deadline globally. Global governments and country governments are alive to the fact that change needs to happen by that date. Certifiers are starting to address this issue and improve their standards, strengthen their standards. So that's going to necessitate the changes from the producers. And it's all coming together. The global consciousness is awakening, and we really need to start taking action on this. Again, I feel that it's a far greater risk to stay quiet on this issue rather than address it proactively. We don't have all the answers. We might never have all the answers, but I think starting to tackle this in a public way and committing to a phased improvement plan is going to resonate very, very effectively with consumers.
Yeah, I definitely agree completely with you, Sofika. I think companies have an opportunity to tell their consumers why they're doing this and maybe why they're charging a little more for their products, but there's a reason. And consumers nowadays are expecting companies to be, have corporate responsibility, be sustainable, but consumers can't know that unless the companies come out and say it in a very easy way, very digestible way for consumers, because, supply chain policies are very complicated, but in a nutshell, you can explain why you care about animal welfare and why this also kind of translates into better environmental policies and better environmental results from your companies as well. And the reality is aquatic animal welfare is a very, very tied to public health, to environmental caring and all of that. So you can easily create a narrative of how aquatic animal welfare not only protects the individual fish and other aquatic animals, but also the societal goals overall of improving sustainability in many different aspects. So, kind of creating those stories is something we can help you with, and working with the certifiers, for example, and the producers can create like this whole supply chain story that consumers really, I think, are interested to hear. Anyone else want to jump in, or shall we continue? We have a few more questions. Okay, so Jane asks, what do you see as being the main opportunities and benefits for companies around the world? Around improved aquatic animal welfare, sorry. What are the opportunities and benefits for companies? Any thoughts, Chris, Sofika?
Sure, I'll jump in. The opportunities are, if you're out there first or second or third, sort of leading in this space, again, I think that'll resonate incredibly well. You have the opportunity to drive the conversation, to brand yourself as a leader in this space. And I think that's going to yield really, really positive results. The other benefit that it has is it creates this catalytic effect where it sends very clear signals down throughout the supply chain to producers that, as Chris was mentioning, there are some producers that are already engaged in these practices. They've already invested in the technology, but they just haven't yet found a market for their high welfare fish or high welfare shrimp. And so that can really catalyze the change that needs to happen, and then we'll see ripple effects. So I think the opportunities are there, and there is some fantastic storytelling to be had. As soon as someone begins engaging in this space. There are 2 trials underway actually right now with leading grocers in Europe on 2 species. One is on shrimp and one is on sea bream. So there's already exploration of this in the marketplace in Europe, at least.
I would say that one of the biggest benefits in leading in this space is to minimize your risk to your company, because as we do see that the trend is moving and happening now and starting to pick up pace for aquaculture for several years now, but now for fisheries as well. So leading in the space by publicly committing to animal welfare policies in your corporate policy is something that could help you in reduce your inherent ESG risks, to incorporate corporate social responsibility types of policies, and to give you just a right to act in the space, being a business that utilizes animals as in its operations.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of investment banks and kind of financial institutions wanting to know more about aquatic animal welfare and the risks that it entails to ignore this in the supply chain. And this is because I think financial institutions are also evolving in their thinking of, yes, we cannot keep supporting industries or companies that are harming the environment, the animals, because of all the consequences that we are seeing today. So we are seeing that shift also in terms of investment. And I think in a few years that will be top need from an investment institution to fund corporations and producers in terms of their long-term projects. So it also kind of helps you take the first steps before that it's even a requirement and you're ready when that comes. Okay, let's continue. Maybe this can be a question for Tessa, who I think is somewhere in the chat. What is the importance of research in aquatic animal welfare and which area would need more attention? So Tessa, do you want to write that on the chat while we answer some more questions? Another one, any thoughts on how the industry can be educating end consumers on fish welfare? Are there any methods that have worked to illustrate to consumers what they can do to support higher welfare standards, including paying more? Any thoughts? Sofika, I think you were doing this for a long time with rating agencies. So do you want to take this one?
Yeah, thank you. There are so many opportunities. I think we could certainly absolutely help support with ideas, but what we can't do is put your specific companies or corporations kind of brand and stamp on it, and the language that you use. You, of course, are experts in how to market yourselves most effectively to your target audience. But in terms of concepts and ideas and suggestions, we are full of them. So anything from, specific campaigns, maybe on key dates throughout the year, like World Ocean Day in June, of course, Earth Day. There are so many days of celebration around the year that you could launch an education campaign. You can promote it through your flyers. You can have in-store displays. You can have in-store education, education tables, anything like that, handouts, pamphlets, creating little videos, online promotions and engagement tactics. So yes, we are full of ideas. But again, I think that each individual corporation would be most expert at rolling it out most effectively to your audience, but very keen to get into that creative marketing space with you.
Great, thank you. Sofika, I think this is also a question for you, or maybe Chris. Please, can you expand on the 2030 deadline? What exactly is being asked of governments, businesses by 2030?
Do you want to take that one? Yeah, go, Chris.
Yeah. So what Sofika was referring to was the Global Sustainable Development Goals that has a deadline of being achieved by 2030. We're slightly behind schedule as a global population in the 17 different SDG goals that they have underlined. Some of them are related to improving food security, zero hunger, improving climate change adaptation and mitigation, and obviously improving the lives of aquatic animals below water. And that also includes improving marine ecosystem health. So based on these 17 targets, many governments have decided to incorporate them into their national targets. And by 2030, for example, this was very recent, 30% of the high seas by 2030, which the different governments will need to adopt into their national legislation. And in the EU, for example, there is the EU Green Deal that various governments within the EU will have to adopt into their national legislation, but meet many of the requirements and suggestions that the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals have set. So in terms of life below water, looking at how to reduce illegal, underreported, unregulated fishing, and ghost gear, plastics pollution, and overfishing. What we would like to see is more conversation that could involve aquatic animal welfare into this sphere. Currently, the SDGs in both farmed animals and aquatic animals lacks specific wording on improvement of their welfare. So this is another area of work that we are working on, is to encourage the discourse at the UN level to include animal welfare. So having said that, a lot of governments are already looking at how to incorporate aquatic animal welfare into their national legislation. And as Sofika mentioned earlier, the UK Sentient Bill, for example, recognizes cephalopods and decapods as sentient beings and will require stunning and slaughter, humane stunning and slaughter for them. And also the EU is looking at fishes in general and how to incorporate their welfare into EU's policies. So, sorry, that was another very long and ended answer, but hopefully that answers your question.
Great. So I think we're supposed to be ending now, but we still have a few more questions. Should we just continue for a few more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep going. And thank you, everyone, for your fantastic questions. Really enjoying this part of the presentation.
Yeah, and if ever anyone has to jump off, if you have previous engagements, please do, but we will send you the full recording after the call. Great. So next question. How would you suggest tackle the challenge around small companies and or artisanal fisher communities that do not have the resources for certification to address the animal welfare challenges? Yeah, this is a question we ask ourselves a lot. So, as you have probably seen from our presentation today, we are more focused on larger producers and large scale buyers, which usually buy from, larger facilities. But I think, some work that is being done in this space where direct work with the producers is done, creating like associations of producers can really help create a network for them where they can offer higher welfare fish and, reach a market that may be unattainable for each producer themselves. So, there's some work being done in India by Fish Welfare Initiative, which is one of the members of our alliance, and they work with producers on the ground to get them to improve welfare interventions and then create this alliance of producers that can then sell to companies. So I think that approach is really interesting. But I think there are many, many options of tackling these issues in parts of the world where maybe the industry isn't as integrated. And, it still depends on small aquaculture farms or small fishermen. And I think, some of the ideas we've had is maybe having a certification that has low cost, that is maybe run by organizations on the ground, that maybe has funding from, sources interested in improving aquatic animal welfare. Like, for example, if a company in the global north is interested in supporting small producers, maybe they could finance a little bit of the certification. So it's not so much of a burden to the producers themselves, but in the end creates like that added value for the supply chain. So those are a couple of ideas, but I think there's a lot to be done in this space. And that is why we work with groups on the ground, with organizations in each country, because they know what's going on in each country. They can kind of understand what are the opportunities. I think because fish production is so varied, there's so many species, there's so many types of productions that answer can be very different in each country, and we need to be open and flexible to that. So creating those bridges, I think, is the main thing, bridges between the producers and the welfare improvements, whether that is equipment or whether that is improvements that can be done with training of the staff, things like that. Getting the information to the producers is the main thing. Anyone else want to add something?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. Thanks, Catalina. Absolutely. Small scale producers, smaller scale retailers or independent, retailers or fish shops, absolutely critical to creating change in this space as well. Last year, it was the year of the artisanal fishery. Artisanal fishers and small scale sellers are very, very important. They're nimble. They can be really adaptive. Yes, they typically don't have the resources that large scale producers or retailers would have, yet they have the ability to also create these really, really healthy and beneficial kind of micro economies as well. So I would say, absolutely, we will do whatever we can to provide support to those interested in creating change in this space as well. Often the limitation will be, I can't source this piece of technology, even if it's $500 to improve my welfare. So maybe there's some magic that can happen if we can shed a light on that type of producer and create some connections throughout the marketplace. But I think that since 50% of global seafood is produced in an artisanal fashion and by small scale fisheries and aquaculture producers. Absolutely, this has to be part of the discourse, and they can help shine a light on solutions as well that we might not have thought of to date.
Great, thank you, Sofika. So we have an answer from Tessa, who is our senior researcher, and that's why we called for her. So the question was, what is the importance of research in aquatic animal welfare and which area would need more attention? So Tessa says that research helps contribute to a growing database of knowledge related to positive welfare for aquatic animals that we can then interpret and implement in the real world. However, due to the variety of species that are farmed or caught, the database need to be quite extensive, and research related to additional species-specific requirements or recommendations that promote optimal conditions and trials or pilot projects that analyze some of our recommendations would be extremely helpful. And I think we have talked about this, like how, and I'm sorry about the noise. Mexico City is a very noisy city. There's always something going on the street. But yeah, I think, for example, pilot projects with companies working with their producers can inform the actual benefits and improvements that they see within that company and what that means for the supply chain in general. So I think there's a lot of research in academic settings, which is of course really important, and it's where knowledge stems from and where technology can be created and later applied. But I think actual real world research in supply chains is also really valuable. And that's kind of what we're looking for, like creating these relationships between the producer and the end consumer, or the retailer or the company that is going to purchase those products, to see what is the real value in the whole chain. And that's why we are kind of suggesting these pilot projects to take place, so we can kind of share with the world the results of those projects. Anyone else want to add something? Final thought? Okay, well, we still have a few questions, so let's try to go through them as fast as we can. What is your suggestion about best awareness ways for aquatic animal welfare, especially in African countries? Bello asked this question. Any thoughts? I can start with this one. So we work with a lot of groups in Africa that are on the ground, because each country, of course, is very different. In Africa has different species that are being farmed or fished, depending on if they have a coast or not. Like every country in the world really is very different. So I think that is always our approach, working with the groups on the ground to understand what is happening and what can be done. In some countries, maybe the best way forward is with policy, so creating regulations or creating legislation around aquatic animal welfare. In others, that may be more difficult or not available, so it's better to work directly with producers. In others, maybe corporations are the solution. So I think it has to be a very country-specific approach. But I think in Africa and Asia and Latin America, some of the hurdles that we see is that the industry is not very well defined. There's not a lot of information about what happens in the farms, how it's integrated, how the industry works in general. So what we are seeing in Africa, which is very interesting, is that the first steps that are being taken is what is happening in the industry. Let's do some research on how many farmers, what types of species, what kind of welfare interventions already exist. Actually, there is a report coming out soon from Nigeria, from a great group in Nigeria, who Dr. Kiki is a member of our board, and she leads this organization. And they did this really great research kind of to understand what is going on in Nigeria in the aquaculture industry, and that can help inform the next step. So I think that should be the first thing that we do in Africa, understand the industry, but also the consumers. They also did some surveys on what the consumers eat, what the consumers need, what they look for, what kind of consumers they are, like the gender, the age, all of that. All of that can help inform the strategies that can be taken in each country. So I think, yeah, that's kind of the approach that is being taken in countries where those industries aren't yet defined. Any final thoughts, anyone else? Great. Well, I think we ran out of time. So Vika, do you want some final words to close?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Great Q&A. And I think we did not get to all of the questions, but I'm sure that someone on the team has taken note of them. We will respond to you in the next few days. Absolutely. Again, the session was recorded, so the recording will be sent out to everyone. Please feel free to share it widely. Share it within your organizations or other places if you want to sort of educate and engage others in this very rapidly evolving dialogue on a priority issue. Thank you again, of course, for your interest in this webinar, in this topic. I think that it's the start of something fantastic. We can't wait to see who's going to begin engaging with us. Again, we are here. We will offer a customized approach, and we really, really want you to succeed, because when you succeed, we succeed, but most importantly, animals succeed as well. So thank you. Have a fantastic rest of your days, and we will absolutely be in touch.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.